Bismarck. There is perhaps no name in naval history that is more recognizable. But does she really deserve the fame and prestige that her name carries? She sank the pride of the Royal Navy, but just 9 days later, she was sunk herself without sinking any more ships. The Bismarck was touted as the most powerful battleship on Earth, yet the Japanese battleship Yamato had turrets over 3 inches bigger than Bismarck's and armor that was 4 inches thicker. The wreck of the Bismarck has also been known about for many years, so she isn't some lost legend of the deep. All of this raises the question, why is the Bismarck such a legendary battleship? To understand that, we need to turn back the clock a little bit. After the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles had reduced Germany's navy to a coastal force, forbidding modern battleships outright. Yet even during these restrictions, German naval planners quietly preserved institutional knowledge, studying foreign developments and sketching theoretical replacements for the aging pre-dreadnoughts that still formed the fleet's backbone. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, rearmament became state policy, and the soon-to-be Kriegsmarine was finally given political backing to think again in terms of capital ships. The immediate concern was actually not Britain, but instead France, whose new Dunkirk-class battleships threatened to outclass anything Germany could put to sea. By the end of the year, the Reichsmarine began preliminary design studies for a ship that could defeat Dunkirk while still plausibly fitting within the limits Germany hoped to negotiate internationally. Early concepts explored vessels of roughly 30,000 to 35,000 tons, armed with either 13-inch or 15-inch guns, heavily protected against cruiser-killer battleships rather than true British capital ships. Speed was emphasized as German planners envisioned Atlantic operations against commerce and wanted a ship fast enough to disengage from stronger opponents. At the same time, lingering fears from the First World War, particularly vulnerability to plunging fire and underwater hits, pushed designers toward an unusually thick and complex armor scheme, even at the cost of displacement efficiency. Everything accelerated in 1935 with the signing of the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which granted Germany the legal right to build battleships up to 35,000 tons. This removed the need for deception and allowed the design to solidify rapidly. Intelligence on foreign navies now shaped the ship more directly. Britain's King George V class was still uncertain, but France's planned Richelieu class, with 15-inch guns, forced Germany's hand. The main battery debate ended in favor of 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, giving the ship clear superiority over French designs while remaining competitive with any British battleship likely to be encountered. Armor was increased further, resulting in a massive belt and deck system intended to keep the ship afloat even after severe damage, reflecting Germany's deep anxiety about losing rare capital ships early in a war. Her protection relied on a thick belt plus an internal sloped turtleback deck optimized for medium-range fighting in poor North Atlantic visibility. The trade-off was relatively lighter horizontal protection against long-range plunging fire, but exceptional resistance to belt hits and underwater damage. In practice, she proved extraordinarily hard to sink quickly. Richelieu represented a very different answer to the same problem. France expected fast engagements against Italy in clear Mediterranean conditions and concentrated firepower forward. As a result, Richelieu carried the heaviest turret and barbette armor of the 3, paired with a very strong deck over magazines. Her belt was slightly thicker than Bismarck's, but her real strength lay in front-loaded protection, allowing her to fight bow-on while minimizing exposed area. Ideal for head-on duels. King George V reflected British expectations of long-range gunnery and the need to protect a global fleet. She mounted the thickest belt armor and emphasized horizontal deck protection, especially over magazines, to counter plunging fire. Unlike Bismarck, KGV sacrificed a massively armored conning tower and relied more on redundancy and internal subdivision than on extreme localized thickness. By 1936, the design was finalized, approved, and ordered, and construction began that July at Blohm & Voss in Hamburg. From the outset, Bismarck was conceived less as a fleet flagship in a decisive battle and more as a strategic weapon. A solitary, heavily protected predator meant to tie down vastly superior enemy forces. Her planning was driven by political ambition, lessons painfully learned in World War I, and a constant effort to not only anticipate, but to overmatch the ships Germany expected to face first. Ordered under the provisional name Ersatz Hannover, a replacement for the aging pre-dreadnought SMS Hanover, Bismarck took shape as Germany's most ambitious naval project. Contract F was awarded to Blohm & Voss in Hamburg, where her keel was laid on July 1, 1936. She was launched on February 14, 1939, in a carefully staged ceremony christened by Dorothee von Löwenfeld, granddaughter of Otto von Bismarck, while Adolf Hitler delivered the address. As fitting out began, her original straight stem was replaced with a raked Atlantic bow, improving seakeeping for North Atlantic operations. Commissioned on August 24, 1940, command passed to Kapitän zur See Ernst Lindemann, and sea trials were scheduled in the Baltic. Trials began in September 1940 as Bismarck departed Hamburg under escort, moving through Kiel Bay and onto Gotenhafen in the Gulf of Danzig. Her machinery was pushed hard in speed and endurance runs, and her handling closely scrutinized. It was during these tests that a serious weakness emerged. When steering by propeller revolutions alone, the ship proved stubbornly resistant to turning, even with the outer shafts driving at full power in opposite directions. Gunnery trials followed in November, confirming Bismarck as an exceptionally stable firing platform. By December, trials concluded and she returned to Hamburg for minor modifications and final completion. Plans to resume trials in January 1941 were derailed when a wreck blocked the Kiel Canal, trapping the battleship in port for weeks as winter storms delayed clearance. The enforced inactivity infuriated Lindemann, who lamented the loss of irreplaceable sea time and the inevitable delay to combat readiness. During this pause, Bismarck unknowingly gave up one of her last secrets. A visit by the Swedish naval attaché resulted in a detailed report that soon reached Britain. Though incomplete, it provided the Royal Navy with its first substantial picture of the ship they would soon hunt across the Atlantic. On March 6th, Bismarck finally received orders to sail for Kiel. She moved under tight protection. Fighters overhead, armed escorts alongside, and an icebreaker clearing the way. 2 days later, in the narrow confines of the Kiel Canal, she briefly grounded on the southern bank, an ignominious pause that lasted less than an hour. By the next day, she reached Kiel, where her crew loaded ammunition and fuel, applied a disruptive dazzle scheme, and endured an unsuccessful British air raid on the harbor. On March 17th, the elderly battleship Schlesien, now reduced to icebreaking duty, escorted Bismarck through frozen waters to Gotenhafen, where final combat training resumed. At the highest levels of the Kriegsmarine, the plan was clear. Under Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, heavy surface ships were to continue raiding Allied commerce in the Atlantic. The Scharnhorst class had just returned from a successful foray, and Bismarck was meant to follow, joined by her sister Tirpitz and supported by the raiders already at sea. The operation was timed for late April 1941, deliberately aligned with a new moon to cloak the breakout, but the plan unraveled ship by ship. Tirpitz slipped behind schedule and would not be combat-ready for months. Gneisenau lay crippled in Brest after torpedo and bomb damage, while Scharnhorst entered a boiler overhaul so extensive she was ruled out entirely. British air attacks further delayed the readiness of Germany's heavy cruisers. With the force shrinking by the week, Fleet Commander Günther Lütjens urged delay, but the Naval High Command refused to wait. There were ample reasons to postpone the sortie. By autumn, Tirpitz would be ready, and Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would likely return to service, forming a far stronger striking force. Spring also brought short nights, making a covert breakout into the Atlantic far more difficult. Yet despite these risks, the plan to send Bismarck and Prince Eugen to sea remained compelling. Britain's supply situation was precarious, and another 5 months of relative quiet would only allow her defenses to harden. There was also the growing fear that the United States might soon enter the war, vastly expanding Allied detection and surveillance. For Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, it was better to strike while conditions still allowed, using Bismarck's full potential to maintain pressure on Britain's lifelines. If the ships could slip into the Atlantic unseen, they could vanish into the ocean's vastness and prey on convoys at will. While these decisions took shape, Fleet Commander Günther Lütjens met with U-boat Chief Karl Dönitz in Paris on April 8th. The two men, long familiar with one another, agreed on a loose but dangerous cooperation. Submarines would continue their patrols as planned, but any chance to coordinate attacks with Bismarck would be seized immediately. To ensure coordination at sea, a U-boat liaison officer was assigned aboard the battleship, binding surface raiders and submarines into a single opportunistic threat. At a final meeting in Paris on April 26th, Raeder pressed the issue. Delay, he argued, only gave the enemy time to recover. Reluctantly, Lütjens agreed. The operation, now codenamed Operation Rheinübung, would proceed with what remained, Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen alone, sailing into the Atlantic against a tightening Allied net. On May 5th, Adolf Hitler arrived at Gotenhafen to inspect Bismarck, riding at anchor in the roadstead, and her sister Tirpitz lying alongside the pier. The Führer's personal pennant and the flag of the fleet chief were hoisted in ceremony. Grand Admiral Raeder was absent with Fleet Commander Günther Lütjens, received Hitler himself, and carefully said nothing of the impending sortie. Before dawn on May 13th, Lütjens and his staff boarded Bismarck. That afternoon, she exercised in the Bay of Danzig, refueling alongside Prince Eugen before anchoring again off Gotenhafen. The following day, during further drills with the light cruiser Leipzig, misfortune struck once more. Bismarck's massive 12-ton portside crane failed. Because it was essential for handling aircraft and boats, departure was delayed yet again while repairs were made. At last, on the 16th of May, the final obstacles were cleared. Lütjens signaled Group North that his ships were ready. Finally, the start date for Operation Rheinübung was set for 2 days later, and Bismarck's long-awaited break for the Atlantic was finally imminent. Just before noon on May 18, 1941, the port in Gotenhafen stirred to life as the German warships docked there became a hive of activity. Admiral Günther Lütjens, accompanied by his aide, first went aboard Prince Eugen to inspect her crew. He then returned to Bismarck, where a final conference brought together the two commanders, Captain Ernst Lindemann and Captain Helmuth Brinkmann. Lütjens outlined the plan. If weather allowed, they would bypass the Norwegian fjords, refuel at sea from the tanker Weissenberg, and break into the Atlantic via the Denmark Strait. By the start of the operation, Bismarck's crew had increased to 2,221 officers and enlisted men. This included an admiral's staff of nearly 65 and a prize crew of 80 sailors, who could be used to crew transports captured during the mission. At noon, Bismarck slipped from her berth to the familiar strains of Muss in Den, played by the fleet band, and anchored in Gotenhafen's roadstead to load fuel and stores. Operation Rheinübung had begun. A ruptured fuel hose cut the battleship short by about 200 tons, not critical, but enough to be noted. That night, Prince Eugen weighed anchor shortly after 2100. Bismarck followed at 0200 on the 19th of May. The two ships rendezvoused off Rügen at 11:25, where Lindemann announced to his crew that they were heading into the North Atlantic to strike British shipping for months to come. Escorted westward by destroyers, the pair threaded the closed Great Belt during the night of the 19th of May and emerged into the Kattegat by morning, moving steadily toward the open ocean and the hunt ahead. Almost immediately, things began to go wrong for the operation. On May 20th, as the German force crossed the Kattegat in clear weather, secrecy began to unravel. Fishing boats, Danish and Swedish, watched the great ships pass, and at 1300, the Swedish cruiser Gotland, commanded by Captain Knut G. Ogren, sighted the formation and dutifully reported it to Stockholm while shadowing the Germans for 2 hours. Admiral Günther Lutyens assumed the worst and immediately signaled Group North that he had been observed. He was right to worry. The report filtered through Swedish channels and reached the British naval attaché in Stockholm, Captain Henry W. Denham. Before the day was out, from the British embassy, Denham sent a message to the Admiralty in London, quietly alerting Britain that Germany's most powerful battleship was on the move. Kattegat, today 20th May, at 1500, 2 large warships, escorted by 3 destroyers, 5 ships, and 10 or 12 planes, passed Marstrand to the northeast. The sighting report soon reached Captain Henry Denham, Britain's naval attaché in Sweden, who promptly forwarded it to the Admiralty. At the same time, codebreakers at Bletchley Park confirmed what London already feared. Intercepted signals revealed that Bismarck and Prince Eugen had embarked prize crews and requested additional charts, clear signs of an Atlantic raid. Reconnaissance Supermarine Spitfire aircraft were immediately dispatched to scour the Norwegian coast. Unaware of how close discovery now was, Günther Lutyens guided his squadron toward the Norwegian coast. Shortly after 0900, the ships entered the Kors Fjord in clear weather. Lutyens had intended to bypass Norway entirely, but the bright skies convinced him to shelter in the fjords and resume the breakout under cover of night. Ironically, German reconnaissance suggested the opposite. Reports showed British carriers and battleships still anchored at Scapa Flow, convincing Admiral Günther Lutyens that surprise remained intact. Pilots were taken aboard, and by noon, Bismarck dropped anchor in Grimstad Fjord, lying just a few hundred meters from the rocky shore. Prince Eugen continued north with her destroyer escorts and anchored in Kalvanis Bay, where 2 merchant ships were placed alongside as improvised torpedo protection. The long approach from Gotenhafen to Bergen, nearly 950 miles, was complete, but the pause meant precious hours slipping away as Allied eyes began to turn north. By late morning on May 21st, the hunt was already tightening. At 1100, RAF Coastal Command launched 2 reconnaissance Supermarine Spitfire aircraft from Scotland to sweep the Norwegian coast. Just after 13:15, despite a pair of Bf-109 fighters circling overhead to protect her from British air attacks, Flying Officer Michael F. Suckling spotted the German ships near Bergen from high altitude and captured clear photographs before returning safely to Wick. The earlier sightings by the Swedish cruiser Gotland and Norwegian resistance observers had already compromised secrecy. Now the evidence was unmistakable. Had the Germans risked the slow transit of the Kiel Canal, this chain of discovery might have been avoided, but the delay was judged unacceptable. While anchored in Norway, Bismarck and Prince Eugen hastily repainted their striped Baltic camouflage in Atlantic gray. Low on fuel, Prince Eugen refueled from the tanker Wolin. Bismarck did not refuel in Norway, as her orders did not call for it, a decision that would prove costly. She had already sailed about 200 tons short of full capacity and had burned roughly another 1,000 tons on the passage from Gotenhafen. By late afternoon, refueling was complete. and at 19:30, the ships weighed anchor. Soon after, German intelligence intercepted a British signal warning aircraft to watch for 2 battleships and 3 destroyers heading north. As darkness fell, the force slipped out of the fjords, steering due north into open water. In Britain, the response was immediate. Admiral John Tovey, commanding the home fleet, ordered the heavy cruisers HMS Suffolk and HMS Norfolk to patrol the Denmark Strait. When the Spitfire photographs arrived later that day, positively identifying Bismarck and her escort, the die was cast. Shortly before midnight, after receiving word from a brave reconnaissance flight in harsh weather that the Norwegian harbor was now empty, the battlecruiser HMS Hood, the battleship Prince of Wales, and a screen of destroyers sailed from Scapa Flow, racing north to block the exit south and east of Iceland. The chase had begun. On the 22nd of May, the weather turned in Germany's favor. Through the night, the formation pushed north with destroyers leading and Prince Eugen closing the rear. At 0420, the escorts peeled away for Trondheim, leaving Bismarck and Prince Eugen to drive on alone at 24 knots. Late in the morning, a submarine and air alarm sent both ships zigzagging for half an hour. When it passed, crews hastily dulled the telltales, painting turretops and covering deck swastikas with canvas to thwart aerial identification. They then shaped a northwest course for the Denmark Strait. Cloud and fog smothered the sea all day, so dense that searchlights flicked on intermittently just to keep station. It was the kind of weather raiders prayed for, perfect cover to slip unseen into the Atlantic. Back in Germany, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder finally briefed Adolf Hitler at the Berghof that Bismarck and Prince Eugen were already en route to attack British commerce. Hitler was uneasy, voicing doubts and fears, but Raeder pressed the case. The operation would go on. On May 23rd, the fog held. At 1300, clocks aboard Bismarck and Prince Eugen were set back an hour as the ships edged west. By mid-afternoon, they turned toward the narrow corridor between the Greenland ice and British minefields, activating their magnetic protection systems. Icebergs loomed out of the mist, false alarms in a treacherous sea, until, at 1922, the real danger appeared. The British heavy cruiser HMS Suffolk flickered into view at 7 miles, then vanished again, but not before reporting 1 battleship and 1 cruiser heading southwest. An hour later, HMS Norfolk emerged from the fog. This time, Bismarck answered instantly, firing 5 salvos, 3 straddling the target and forcing Norfolk to sheer away behind smoke. The 2 British cruisers settled into shadowing positions astern, Suffolk to starboard and Norfolk to port, using radar and radio direction finding to keep contact and summon heavier forces. The exchange added one more catastrophic mistake for the mission. The blast from Bismarck's forward turrets disabled her forward radar, prompting Admiral Gunther Lütjens to reverse the order. Prince Eugen, her radar intact, took the lead while Bismarck covered the rear with her guns, an arrangement that would sow confusion the next morning. Lütjens could still have turned back to refuel and break contact, as he had done before. Instead, trusting the fog and believing Britain's heavy ships were still distant, he pressed on for the Atlantic. British radar made sure there would be no easy escape. Around 2200, Admiral Gunther Lütjens ordered Bismarck to reverse course in a sudden 180-degree turn, hoping to ambush the British cruisers shadowing him. A rain squall briefly hid the battleship from sight, but not from radar. HMS Suffolk immediately detected the maneuver and slipped clear. The German flagship fell back into line behind Prinz Eugen, steaming into the night, tracked but still hoping to slip free as the British cruisers held their stations, relaying the Germans' bearings and positions back to the home fleet. By dawn on May 24th, the storm finally broke, revealing clear skies and a cold sea. At 0507, hydrophone operators aboard Prince Eugen caught a new sound on the water. 2 fast, turbine-driven ships closing in from the west. The hunt was over. The battle was about to begin. As dawn approached in the early hours of the cold North Atlantic on May 24, 1941, the weather cleared and visibility sharpened. Bismarck and Prinz Eugen pressed on at 28 knots, steering southwest, when, around 0530, Prinz Eugen's hydrophones caught the unmistakable thrum of two ships closing from the port side. German radar showed nothing. Minutes later, shapes emerged from the haze. First one contact, then another. Uncertainty reigned. Aboard both German ships, the newcomers were misidentified as heavy cruisers, a critical error that dictated ammunition choices. Believing they faced cruisers, Prinz Eugen's gunnery officer ordered high-explosive shells. In reality, the approaching silhouettes were HMS Hood and Prince of Wales, charging in at 28 knots on a converging course. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, keenly aware of Hood's vulnerability at long range, was racing to close the distance. For Admiral Gunther Lütjens, there was no longer any choice. The moment for evasion had passed. Battle was unavoidable. Because the two German ships cut nearly identical silhouettes in the half-light, Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland initially made a fatal assumption. At 0549, he ordered both British ships to engage the leading German vessel, believing Prinz Eugen to be Bismarck. The British then turned 20 degrees to starboard, tightening the approach. Moments later, at 0552, Holland realized the error and ordered fire shifted to the trailing ship, Bismarck, but HMS Hood continued tracking the wrong target. Aboard Prince of Wales, Lieutenant Commander Colin McMullen correctly locked onto Bismarck, following a mile astern. At 0552, from roughly 12.5 miles, Hood fired first, followed half a minute later by Prince of Wales. Only their forward turrets could bear as they closed head-on. The opening exchange confirmed the truth to the Germans. These were not cruisers, but capital ships. Admiral Gunther Lütjens immediately signaled, "I'm in a fight with two heavy units." Prince of Wales's first salvo fell long, the next straddled Bismarck even as mechanical trouble began to plague her guns. Hood's opening fire splashed short of Prinz Eugen, showering the cruiser with fragments and spray as the battle fully ignited. The British shells were already landing close, but the German guns still remained silent. Aboard the Bismarck, the first artillery officer, Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Schneider, in the foretop command post, requested several times permission to open fire without reply from the bridge. Lütjens hesitated, but Lindemann intervened, muttering, "I will not let my ship be shot out from under my ass." He demanded permission to fire from Lütjens, who finally relented. At 0555, as Vice Admiral Holland's force swung 20 degrees to port, the picture finally snapped into focus. Bismarck at last identified HMS Hood and a King George V class battleship. Bismarck opened fire, Prinz Eugen following instantly, both concentrating on Hood at roughly 11 miles. Bismarck's first salvo fell short. Aboard Prinz Eugen, torpedo tubes were trained and standing by. Moments later, Prince of Wales straddled Bismarck, likely scoring a hit, while the German gunnery proved devastatingly accurate. At 0557, Prinz Eugen struck Hood's shelter deck near the mainmast, igniting a fierce fire that raced toward the second funnel. Bismarck had been hit as well and began trailing oil across the sea. Admiral Gunther Lütjens reacted at once, ordering Prinz Eugen to shift fire to Prince of Wales, while Bismarck's secondary guns joined in. The geometry of the fight now favored the Germans. Bismarck brought all 8 main guns to bear. Prince of Wales could answer with only 5. Hood, still mistargeted, continued firing at the wrong ship, while the balance of firepower tipped decisively against her. At 0600, HMS Hood and Prince of Wales were beginning another 20-degree turn to port, trying to bring their after-turrets into action. At that moment, at a range of less than 9 miles, Bismarck's 5th salvo struck home. 2 of the shells landed short, striking the water close to the ship, but at least one of the 38-centimeter armor-piercing shells struck Hood and penetrated her thin deck armor. The shell reached Hood's rear ammunition magazine and detonated 112 tons of cordite propellant. The result was catastrophic. A vast explosion tore the battlecruiser apart, shocking even the seasoned German observers. Overhead, a British short Sunderland from Iceland briefly witnessed Hood erupt in flame before being driven off by intense anti-aircraft fire. Aboard Bismarck, officers stared in disbelief as one of Britain's proudest warships vanished in seconds, an image that would be burned into memory forever. Bismarck's 4th artillery officer, Kapitän Leutnant Burkhard von Mullenheim-Rechberg, described what he saw. At first, the Hood was nowhere to be seen. In her place was a colossal pillar of black smoke reaching into the sky. Gradually, at the foot of the pillar, I made out the bow of the battlecruiser projecting upwards at an angle, a sure sign that she had broken in two. The massive explosion broke the back of the ship between the mainmast and the rear funnel. The forward section continued to move forward briefly before the inrushing water caused the bow to rise into the air at a steep angle. The stern also rose as water rushed into the ripped-open compartments. Schneider exclaimed, "He is sinking!" over the ship's loudspeakers. In only 8 minutes of firing, Hood had disappeared, taking all but 3 of her crew of 1,419 men with her. With HMS Hood gone in a pillar of fire, Bismarck swung her guns onto Prince of Wales. Maneuvering to avoid Hood's wreckage, the British battleship crossed between the sinking cruiser and the German ships, an exposed position the Germans seized instantly. At 06:02, Bismarck struck Prince of Wales's bridge, killing everyone there except Captain John Leach and 1 other man. The range had closed to about 14,000 meters, and even Prince Eugen's heavy anti-aircraft guns joined the fight. Outmatched and damaged, Prince of Wales laid smoke and began to withdraw at 06:03, having been hit repeatedly, 4 times by Bismarck and 3 by Prince Eugen. Confused hydrophone reports of torpedoes forced the Germans into sharp, evasive turns, spoiling their aim and ending further hits. As she fell back, Prince of Wales fired a few last salvos under local control, scoring no additional damage. By 06:09, the Germans fired their final salvo. To British astonishment, the German ships did not pursue. The exchange had been brutal, but not one-sided. Prince of Wales had landed 3 telling blows on Bismarck, 1 letting seawater flood the bow, another breaching below the belt and flooding machinery spaces, and a 3rd wrecking topside fittings. Yet with only half her main guns still working and serious damage accumulating, Captain Leach ordered a full retreat at 06:13, turning away under smoke. Aboard Bismarck, Captain Ernst Lindemann urged pursuit and destruction of the crippled enemy. Admiral Günther Lütjens refused. Bound by orders to avoid unnecessary battles, he turned Bismarck and Prince Eugen away toward the open North Atlantic, leaving the Denmark Strait strewn with wreckage and the shock of a legend destroyed. In the brief but violent action, Bismarck fired 93 armor-piercing shells and was struck 3 times in return on her port side by 3 14-inch shells. One punched into the hull amidships below the waterline, bursting against the armored torpedo bulkhead and flooding an electrical plant, with some seepage into a boiler room that damage control crews quickly contained. Another hit the bow just above the waterline, tearing straight through the ship without exploding, but leaving a gaping exit hole and allowing roughly 1,000 tons of seawater to flood the forecastle, trapping hundreds of tons of fuel oil in the forward tanks. The 3rd shell passed harmlessly through a boat amidships. The damage slowed Bismarck to about 28 knots and left her trimmed down by the bow with a pronounced list to port, at times lifting the starboard propeller blades clear of the water. Counter-flooding corrected the worst of it. The ship remained fully combat-capable, her guns intact, and crew losses minimal, only a handful lightly wounded. Yet the real cost was invisible. Precious fuel rendered unusable, a hidden wound that would soon shape every decision ahead. The bridge of the Bismarck swarmed with hurried activity. She had just fought what would become one of the most famous naval battles in history and scored a stunning victory, but things were far from peaceful now. Heavy decisions loomed for Admiral Lütjens. After the guns fell silent in the Denmark Strait, Bismarck and Prince Eugen steered southwest. Admiral Günther Lütjens now faced a stark choice: turn back for Norway or press on into the Atlantic. Many would later argue he should have finished off the damaged Prince of Wales and withdrawn north to Trondheim. Captain Ernst Lindemann urged pursuit, but Lütjens refused. Bound by orders to avoid unnecessary engagements and wary of British heavy forces closing in, he chose the ocean. At 8:01, he signaled Group North with a decisive change of plan. Bismarck would head for Saint-Nazaire for repairs, while the undamaged Prince Eugen would continue alone as a commerce raider. In effect, Operation Rheinübung was suspended at least until Bismarck could be made whole again. Why France and not Norway? Saint-Nazaire was farther and would consume more fuel, but it offered immediate access back into the Atlantic. Lütjens had used French ports before with success, and Grand Admiral Raeder wanted pressure on Britain maintained. It was a calculated gamble, one that traded the safety of proximity for speed back into the war. After the engagement, Lütjens reported, "Battle cruiser, probably Hood, sunk. Another battleship, King George V, or Renown, turned away damaged. 2 heavy cruisers maintained contact." At 08:01, he transmitted a damage report and his intentions to OKM, which were to detach Prince Eugen for commerce raiding and to make for Saint-Nazaire for repairs. Shortly after 1000 hours, Admiral Günther Lütjens ordered Prince Eugen to drop astern and assess the damage to Bismarck. The verdict was grim. Broad streams of oil trailed from both sides of the battleship's wake. Once confirmed, Prince Eugen resumed her forward station. An hour later, a shadowing RAF Short Sunderland reported the slick to HMS Suffolk and HMS Norfolk, now joined by the damaged Prince of Wales. Rear Admiral Frederick Wake Walker kept the battleship astern while his cruisers maintained contact. At sea, Admiral Karl Dönitz offered U-boat support. Lütjens requested patrol lines along Bismarck's projected route, one south of Greenland, another in the Bay of Biscay, assembling a tightening net to shepherd the battleship toward France. 3 hours after the sinking of the Hood, the British Admiralty issued the following announcement to the press. British naval forces intercepted early this morning, off the coast of Greenland, German naval forces, including the battleship Bismarck. The enemy were attacked, and during the ensuing action, HMS Hood, wearing the flag of Vice Admiral L.F. Holland, received an unlucky hit in the magazine and blew up. The Bismarck has received damage, and the pursuit of the enemy continues. It is feared there will be few survivors from HMS Hood. In London, with the Admiralty enraged, Winston Churchill ordered an all-out pursuit. The home fleet turned to intercept. Additional cruisers sealed the Denmark Strait. Battleships and carriers converged from across the Atlantic. By late afternoon, Prince of Wales had restored most of her guns and moved forward, ready to strike if the chance came. Early in the morning of the 24th of May, Admiral Lütjens had already decided to detach the Prince Eugen, and at 14:20 sent a semaphore signal to Captain Brinkmann. Intend to shake Stalker as follows. During rain squall, the Bismarck will change course west. Prince Eugen will maintain course and speed until he is forced to change position or 3 hours after the departure of Bismarck. Subsequently, is released to take on oil from Belchen or Lothringen. afterwards pursue independent cruiser war, implementation upon keyword Hood. The move was meant as a distraction. Bismarck would hold the British at bay long enough for Prince Eugen to slip free. To support this gamble, Vice Admiral Karl Dönitz halted U-boat attacks on merchant shipping and began assembling submarines along Bismarck's projected path. Admiral Günther Lütjens intended to draw his pursuers into this underwater ambush south of Greenland. Rain squalls offered fleeting chances. An initial turn failed with HMS Suffolk clinging close, but a second high-speed maneuver succeeded. Prince Eugen held her course and escaped while Bismarck turned aggressively on the shadowers, briefly engaging Suffolk and then Prince of Wales at long range. No hits were scored, but the diversion worked. The cruiser was gone. When the brief exchange ended with no hits, HMS Suffolk slid back to the port side of Bismarck, joining HMS Norfolk and Prince of Wales. The move was meant to guard against a sudden German reversal, but it came at a cost. Bismarck's starboard flank was left exposed, a gap the British would soon pay dearly for. They still had one last chance to strike, but the clock was already running out. Unfortunately for the Germans, this most recent victory was hollow. Fuel was bleeding away with the oil slick, and by nightfall, Bismarck's reserves were critical. By evening, the reality could no longer be ignored. Aboard Bismarck, fuel had become the decisive enemy. At 20:56, Admiral Günther Lütjens signaled Group West that the ship would head straight for Saint-Nazaire. Less than 3,000 tons of fuel remained usable, with nearly 1,000 tons trapped forward beneath flooded compartments. Without recovering it, the battleship would be forced to slow simply to reach France. Had Bismarck refueled in Bergen days earlier, she would now have the freedom to maneuver, to feint and evade. Instead, the shortage shattered Lütjens's plan to lure the British into a Western U-boat trap. The battleship was bound to a single predictable course. In response, German command rushed every available submarine in the Bay of Biscay into a patrol line along Bismarck's projected path, an escort of steel beneath the waves for a wounded giant running out of options. Though damaged, Bismarck could still make 27 to 28 knots, fast enough to match the pursuing King George V. Unless she was slowed, Britain could not stop her from reaching Saint-Nazaire. Recognizing this, Admiral John Tovey detached the carrier HMS Victorious to launch an airstrike. At 2200 on May 25th, 9 ferry swordfish lifted off, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond. In the darkness and cloud, the inexperienced crews nearly attacked their own ships before correcting course, alerting Bismarck's gunners. The battleship threw up towering splashes with her main and secondary guns, forcing the biplanes to weave through walls of water and fire. No aircraft were shot down. One swordfish missed the attack entirely. Of the 8 torpedoes launched, 7 were avoided, but one struck the armored belt amidships, killing 1 sailor and wounding several others. The torpedo itself caused only limited damage. The real harm came from the violent evasive maneuvers. Rapid turns loosened collision mats over the bow shell hole, worsening flooding and forcing the abandonment of a boiler room. Speed collapsed to 16 knots before damage control teams stabilized the ship. After repairs, Bismarck clawed back to 20 knots, judged the most economical speed for the run to France. She was still moving, but the margin for escape was narrowing fast. Air gunner Leslie D. Sayer in the backseat of a Swordfish later recalled, "I saw what I thought was a hit because there was a huge spurt of water coming from the hull of the Bismarck, and I thought to myself, that's us and that's our hit." Despite a storm of anti-aircraft fire, none of the aging ferry Swordfish were shot down. By 0230 on May 26th, all the torpedo bombers had found their way back to HMS Victorious and landed safely in darkness. an extraordinary feat for air crews who had never before attempted night carrier landings. Not all were so fortunate. 2 ferry Fulmar fighters ran out of fuel and ditched at sea. One crew was later rescued by the merchant ship Beaverhill. Below decks, Bismarck's damage control teams fought a quieter battle. Seawater flooding a port boiler room threatened to contaminate the turbo generator feed system. Had saltwater reached the turbines, her speed and her chances would have collapsed. By dawn on May 25th, the danger was contained. The ship slowed to 12 knots as divers pumped fuel aft, successfully recovering several hundred tons. But the reduced speed allowed the British to close the distance, and at 0131, Prince of Wales opened fire. The 2 battleships traded a pair of salvos at long range, but darkness and poor visibility spared both from further damage. Aboard Bismarck, morale remained unexpectedly high. Amid damage reports and repairs, the crew marked a small human moment. Over the loudspeakers, they wished Admiral Gunther Lutyens a happy birthday. It was his 52nd, and the ship sailed on into the night, wounded but unbroken. Astern, Rear Admiral Frederick Wake Walker's cruisers zigzagged defensively against a feared U-boat ambush. During one of these turns, HMS Suffolk briefly lost radar contact. Admiral Gunther Lutyens seized the moment. At 0300, he abandoned any thought of leading the British into submarines and ordered full speed. The British ships tried in vain to re-establish contact with the Bismarck, and at 0401, the Suffolk reported, "Enemy contact lost." While out of radar range, Bismarck swung west, then north, slipping unseen behind her pursuers. Suffolk's captain assumed the battleship had fled west and followed, dispersing the British force at daylight to search by sight. The Royal Navy widened the hunt across the Atlantic. Ships low on fuel spread west and south. HMS Victorious turned away, and Admiral John Tovey pressed toward the mid-ocean. Ark Royal and Force H were still a day away. Vice Admiral Frederick Wake Walker's decision to reposition HMS Suffolk now proved costly. By shifting the cruiser's station, he inadvertently gave Bismarck the room she needed to maneuver, and Admiral Gunther Lutyens seized it without hesitation. Had Suffolk remained on Bismarck's starboard quarter, breaking contact would have been far harder. Yet aboard Bismarck, for some reason, the escape went unnoticed. Believing he was still shadowed, Lutyens transmitted a radio report to Naval Group West in Paris at 0700, unaware that, for the moment, he had slipped free. 1 battleship, 2 heavy cruisers keeping contact. Shortly after 0900, Lutyens sent another long message to Group West describing the engagement that morning and the state of his ship. The messages did not reach Naval Group West until well after 0900. The irony was sharp. At 0846, Group West had already reported that the British had lost contact. From that point on, Bismarck maintained strict radio silence, but it was too late. British direction finding intercepted them but misplotted the bearings, sending Tovey's fleet toward the wrong gap for 7 crucial hours. By the time the error was discovered, Bismarck had carved open a dangerous lead, alone, damaged, and racing toward France with the Atlantic briefly hers again. At 11:52, Lutyens received a personal message from Admiral Raeder. "Heartiest birthday wishes. In view of your recent great armed feat, may you be granted many more such successes as you enter a new year of your life." Minutes later, Lutyens delivered the following speech to the crew by the loudspeakers. "Soldiers of the battleship Bismarck, you have achieved great fame. The sinking of the battle cruiser Hood does not only have a military but also a morale value because Hood was England's pride. The enemy will now attempt to gather its forces and deploy them toward us. Therefore, I released Prince Eugen yesterday noon so that he can conduct his own war on merchant vessels. He has accomplished to evade the enemy. By contrast, because of the hits we have sustained, we have received the order to head for a French harbor. The enemy will gather on the way and will engage us in battle. The German nation is with you in spirit, and we will fire until the barrels glow and until the last projectile has exited the barrel. For us soldiers, the battle cry as of now is victory or death. Admiral Günther Lütjens tried to temper the crew's excitement with a sober assessment of their situation, but the words landed hard. For a moment, a sense of inevitability crept through the ship, and morale sagged. Senior officers moved quickly among the men to steady them, and an hour later, Captain Ernst Lindemann took the loudspeaker himself. His brief address restored confidence, lifting spirits, and reminding the crew that the fight was not yet over. At 16:25, Lütjens received yet another message of congratulations, this time from Hitler. "I send to you today my very best congratulation for your birthday." That same afternoon, Bismarck's chief engineer, Korvettenkapitän Walter Lehmann, and several crewmen began to construct a dummy funnel. This would give the battleship 2 funnels and hopefully confuse the enemy, should Bismarck be detected again. British codebreakers cracked the final clue. On May 25th, a Luftwaffe order to support Bismarck's run for France, decrypted by Jane Fawcett, confirmed what London suspected. The French resistance added proof. German aircraft were moving to cover the battleship. Admiral John Tovey turned his forces toward France, narrowing the net. On the morning of May 26th, as Bismarck pressed toward the French coast, the crew received an unusual order. Repaint the tops of the main and secondary turrets bright yellow for aerial recognition. In heavy seas, the task was punishing. Men clinging to slick steel as waves swept the decks, and the fresh paint was washed away at least once. Still, they persisted, repainting under fire from wind and water as the battered battleship drove on. At 10:30, a Catalina piloted by Dennis Briggs with U.S. Navy Ensign Leonard B. Smith aboard found Bismarck nearly 700 miles northwest of Brest. George, the automatic pilot, was flying the aircraft at 500 feet when we saw a warship. I was in the second pilot's seat when the occupant of the seat beside me, an American, said, "What the devil's that?" I stared ahead and saw a dull, black shape through the mist which curled above a very rough sea. "Looks like a battleship," he said. I said, "Better get closer. Go round its stern." I thought it might be the Bismarck because I could see no destroyers around the ship, and I should have seen them had she been a British warship. I left my seat, went to the wireless operator's table, grabbed a piece of paper, and began to write out a signal. The second pilot had taken over from George and gone up to 1,500 feet into broken cloud. As we came round, he must have slightly misjudged his position, for instead of coming up astern, we found ourselves right over the ship in an open space between the clouds. The first thing I knew about this was when 2 black puffs appeared outside the starboard side wing tip. In a moment, we were surrounded by black puffs. Stuff began to rattle against the hull. Some of it went through and a lot more made dents in it. I scribbled "end of message" and handed it to the wireless operator. In between the smudges of the bursting shells, I looked down on the ship, which seemed to me to be one big, winking flame. She was taking violent, avoiding action by turning hard to starboard, heeling well over. But the hunt was not over. The action was merely about to begin. After more than 31 hours lost in the Atlantic, Bismarck had been found again, but time favored her. At her speed, she was less than a day from U-boat and Luftwaffe protection. Admiral John Tovey's battleships were simply too far away. King George V lay 135 miles to the north, Rodney 125 miles to the northeast and slower. Unless Bismarck could be crippled, neither would catch her. That left one force with a chance, Force H, steaming north from Gibraltar under Vice Admiral James Somerville. The battlecruiser Renown was closest, but with Hood barely 2 days lost, the Admiralty forbade a solo engagement. Everything now depended on Ark Royal. At 8:35, Ark Royal had already sent ferry swordfish searching. When the Catalina's sighting arrived, the two nearest swordfish turned at once. At 11:14, aircraft 2H sighted Bismarck. 7 minutes later, 2F confirmed the contact. More swordfish with long-range tanks were launched to relieve them and hold the trail. The net was tightening, and the next strike would decide everything. At 14:50, 15 ferry swordfish lifted off from Ark Royal, led by Lieutenant Commander J.A. Stuart Moore. An hour later, radar contact was made, and the biplanes plunged to attack, only to discover too late that the target was not Bismarck, but the British cruiser Sheffield sent ahead to shadow her. 11 torpedoes were dropped, none struck home. Faulty magnetic detonators saved Sheffield. Some torpedoes exploded harmlessly, others missed outright. The swordfish battled brutal weather on the return, landing after 1,700 hours on a violently pitching deck. 3 aircraft wrecked their undercarriages as the stern rose and fell by more than 50 feet. The chance was squandered, but the hunt was not over. At 17:40, Sheffield finally sighted Bismarck herself. There would be no more mistakes. Night was closing in, and this was the last real chance to stop the battleship before she reached France. At 19:15, Ark Royal launched a second strike, 15 swordfish again, many of the same battered aircraft, but this time armed with contact detonators and torpedoes set to run shallow. It was the final throw of the dice. As the British closed in, fate played a cruel irony. The German submarine U-556, commanded by Kapitän Leutnant Herbert Wolfarth, sighted Renown and Ark Royal at 19:48, coming out of the mist at high speed, not zigzagging and perfectly positioned for a kill. But U-556 was out of torpedoes. Her last fish spent days earlier. All Wolfarth could do was signal the enemy's course and speed as he witnessed activity on Ark Royal's flight deck, which transpired to be the launching of the second fatal attack on Bismarck. To make things even more heartbreaking for Kapitän Leutnant Wolfarth, U-556 and Bismarck had been built side by side on the slips at Blohm and Voss, with both vessels completed around the same period. When U-556's commissioning drew near, Wolfarth hoped to have a band for the ceremony but lacked the funds to hire one. Kapitän Ernst Lindemann, Bismarck's commanding officer, offered the use of his ship's band instead. In gratitude, Wolfarth created a tongue-in-cheek Patenschaftsurkunde, or Certificate of Sponsorship, pledging that U-556 would safeguard Bismarck. One illustration depicts Wolfarth as the Night Parzival atop U-556, felling aircraft with a sword while simultaneously reaching beneath the waves to halt a torpedo with his thumb. A second illustration portrays the submarine towing the battleship out of danger. I doubt that, in their wildest dreams, either man could have guessed how accurate that drawing would soon become. But unfortunately for the Bismarck and her crew, the drawing remained just that, as the U-556 submerged to avoid being detected. Minutes later, Ark Royal's swordfish, now led by Lieutenant Commander T.P. Coode, closed in. Using Sheffield to fix the range, they began their attack at 20:47. Bismarck's guns erupted, flinging fire into the dark. At least 2 torpedoes struck home, one amidships on the port side, causing little damage, another smashed into the stern on the starboard quarter. That hit was decisive. Both rudders jammed hard over, locking the battleship into an uncontrollable turn. Bismarck swung in a wide circle, then began to stagger northwest into the wind, helpless. As before, none of the swordfish were lost, though several limped back riddled with holes. The damage was catastrophic. At 2140, Admiral Gunther Lütjens signaled Group West. "Ship unable to maneuver. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." The torpedo strike in the stern flooded the steering gear and nearby compartments, sealing Bismarck's fate. Any repair now had to be done underwater. Divers were ordered into the steering compartment, but the violent rush of water made the space untouchable. Heavy seas ruled out lowering men over the side. One last desperate idea was raised: blow the jammed rudders clear and try to steer by propellers alone, but it was abandoned for fear the blast would cripple the screws as well. Deep inside the ship, in the turbine rooms, the reality set in. Bismarck was no longer a ship under command, but a giant driven by the sea itself, her course fixed and her end approaching. Kapitän Lieutenant Gerhard Junak down in the center turbine room described the event. One torpedo which hit amidships caused no damage, but the second affected the rudders disastrously, jamming the portside rudder at a 15-degree angle. Immediately, the Bismarck became no longer maneuverable. The torpedo hit on the rudder shook the ship so badly that even in my zone of action in the turbine room, the deck plates were thrown into the air and the hull vibrated violently. Shortly after the blow, water flooded through the port side gangways into the turbine room, and clouds of gas and smoke filled the room until the forced ventilation cleared it. The stern compartments of the ship were now flooding, but the men who had been stationed there could still be saved, and soon the carpenters and repair crew came through, making their way aft. But the ship pitched so violently in the strong sea swell that it was impossible to keep a foothold in the turbulent water surging through the companionway. All possibilities were now being considered to restore the ship's maneuverability, even if only temporarily. The commander, Kapitän zur See Lindemann, considered reports from Chief Engineer Lehmann, who was in continual contact with the repair and rescue teams. There was much gesticulation, and at one point the chief engineer stepped out of the circle, walked away, turned about, and made a sign of complete refusal. What this was about I'm not certain, but eventually it was found possible to connect the hand rudder. But the old rudder would not budge, and to attempt to cut it away with underwater saws was quite impossible because of the heavy swell. A proposal to force the rudder out from below with the help of explosives was rejected because of the proximity to the propellers. Thus, all experiments with the auxiliary rudder were given up as completely hopeless, with the old one immovable. The torpedo damage sent Bismarck slewing unpredictably and straight toward Sheffield. Around 21:45, Bismarck opened fire at roughly 9 miles, loosing 6 salvos. Sheffield turned away behind smoke, escaping without a hit, though splinters wrecked her radar and wounded a dozen men, 3 fatally. Contact was lost, but at 2200, Sheffield passed bearing and range to Captain Philip Vian's 4th destroyer flotilla. At 22:38, the Polish destroyer Pierun, commanded by Eugeniusz Plowski, sighted the German battleship. Bismarck replied with heavy fire, and the destroyers pressed in. Star shells lit the Black Sea after midnight. Bismarck refused to use searchlights, fighting blind to deny an aiming point. A star shell ignited a small fire on her bow, quickly beaten down. All night, in heavy seas and squalls, the destroyers attacked. All night, Bismarck beat them back with disciplined, accurate gunfire. By 0700, 16 torpedoes had been expended without a hit. At 07:22, the sun rose, revealing a battered unmaneuverability giant still afloat and the endgame about to begin. At 08:47, the execution began. Rodney fired first, followed a minute later by King George V at a range of roughly 20,000 meters. Bismarck answered at 08:49, but only with her 2 forward turrets Anton and Bruno trained on Rodney, her after-turrets could not bear. The imbalance was stark. 4 German guns against 15 British, with Rodney's 9 all forward and King George V adding 6 more. The weight of fire only grew. At 0854, HMS Norfolk joined in with her 8-inch guns, and by 0858, Rodney's secondary battery was hammering as well. Bismarck was being smothered, yet even then, amid the storm of steel, she found her mark. In a brief, defiant moment, the German battleship straddled Rodney, a reminder that, though outgunned, she was not yet silenced. By 0902, the end was accelerating. Bismarck was smashed repeatedly. Hits tore through the forecastle and foremast, destroying the foretop rangefinder. 2 minutes later, Dorsetshire joined the firing line. Now 4 heavy ships, Rodney, King George V, Norfolk, and Dorsetshire, were concentrating on a single target. At 0908, Bismarck's forward fire control and turrets Anton and Bruno were knocked out. Control shifted aft, where Kapitän Lieutenant Burkhard von Müllenheim-Rechberg briefly found the range, only to have his station obliterated by a 14-inch shell minutes later. The after-turrets fought on under local control. Rodney even loosed torpedoes at close range, missing in the chaos. At 0921, turret door was silenced by a catastrophic internal explosion. One forward turret fired a final defiant salvo at 0927. Caesar answered 4 minutes later. Then only scattered secondary guns remained. Quickly crushed beneath the avalanche of British fire, Captain Ernst Lindemann gave the order to scuttle an abandoned ship. With Bismarck helpless, Rodney closed to point-blank range, 2,500 to 4,000 meters, and hammered both flanks with her 16-inch guns. Hits landed shell by shell. Flames burst from Bruno's rear wall. Torpedoes followed, one likely striking home. Even then, the battered battleship refused to sink. Norfolk added torpedoes, men began leaping into the sea. All guns were silent, barrels frozen at odd angles. The superstructure was shredded, decks torn apart, and still, improbably, the mainmast stood, the battle flag snapping in the wind. At 10:16, Rodney ceased fire. Low on fuel, Admiral John Tovey turned away. Behind him lay a floating wreck, finished as a fighting ship, but not yet gone. At 0920, Ark Royal launched 12 Fairey Swordfish for a final strike. They arrived over the battlefield around 10:15 but held off, hemmed in by the thunder of British guns. For a moment, King George V even mistook them for enemy aircraft and opened fire, fortunately, without effect. At 10:20, Dorsetshire closed in and fired 2 21-inch torpedoes from 3,000 meters into Bismarck's starboard side. Both struck, but the wrecked hull barely seemed to notice. Turning back, Dorsetshire fired again at 10:36 from 2,200 meters. This torpedo hit the port side. Overhead, the Swordfish circled, witnesses to the end. By then, Bismarck was heeling heavily to port, water washing the upper deck, secondary turrets nearly submerged. At 10:39, she rolled over and slipped beneath the Atlantic. The guns fell silent. The hunt was over. For nearly 2 hours after the guns first spoke, Bismarck stayed afloat. British fire began to land decisively at 0902 and did not cease until about 10:16. 74 minutes of uninterrupted punishment at ranges that shrank to point blank. Few warships in history could have endured it. The contrast was stark. HMS Hood had been destroyed in 6 minutes only 3 days earlier, yet Bismarck's core defenses largely held. Neither the main belt nor the armored deck appears to have been decisively penetrated, and in the end it was her own crew who ensured she would not be captured. During that final action, 2,876 shells were hurled at her. 380 16-inch from Rodney, 339 14-inch from King George V, 527 8-inch from Norfolk, 254 8-inch from Dorsetshire, 716 6-inch from Rodney, 665.25-inch from King George V. It appears that the sustained rain of fire on the Bismarck had many different effects. When interrogated in Dorsetshire, Kapitän Leutnant von Millenheim-Reckberg volunteered the information that at one time he was in C turret, which was ordered to engage Dorsetshire, but only fired one salvo at the ship. By this time, the personnel in the turret were becoming demoralized and began vacating the turret, remarking, "Why should we stay here for target practice?" He also left the turret. Kapitän Leutnant von Millenheim-Reckberg has not again referred to this story, and it may be taken for granted that he was dazed and considerably shaken at the time of this interrogation. Similar scenes do, however, appear to have taken place in many parts of the ship, for at this time Bismarck was taking severe punishment. According to one prisoner, one officer drew his revolver and shot down some of the crew when they refused to obey him. Another prisoner refers to officers committing suicide. Still another prisoner mentioned that members of the crew lost their nerve and jumped overboard long before action ceased. It is known that almost the entire 400 men of the flak became casualties. No special protection had been arranged for these men during surface action, they merely being ordered to shelter behind the superstructure on the disengaged side and huddling together for protection. Groups of 40 or more men were wiped out at a time. With the ship listing to port and rolling and seas coming inboard, there were washed over the side scores of bodies, both the killed and of the wounded, whose grasp had weakened on whatever object they had been able to clutch. Hit after hit was now being registered on the upper deck, which was speedily reduced to a mass of twisted steel. Boats and lockers had been smashed to pieces. Machinery and instruments twisted and broken. Ready-use ammunition was exploding. A direct hit on the mainmast caused it, as one prisoner described, to spin round like a whirligig and come crashing down over the ship, creating fresh carnage. It hung down like a tangle of vines. Fires had broken out amidships and aft. The forward damage control center had been wrecked by a direct hit. Sheets of flame were issuing from the funnel. The ship's aircraft were also burning, a direct hit having struck a hangar, where a large number of men sheltering there had been killed. Smoke was pouring from holes 2 yards wide, which had been torn in the upper deck by shells which had penetrated below. Shells, according to prisoners, penetrated through the upper deck and the battery deck to the main deck. The majority of prisoners deny that the armored deck itself was pierced. Only one man, an officer, has made a statement to the contrary. He alleges this deck was penetrated in the vicinity of the WT room and suggests that this spot was hit 2 or 3 times in succession. Kapitän Leutnant Junak has stated that one shell penetrated the port turbine room at about 0930. Another entered the boiler room, section 13, between 0915 and 0930, starting a fire, possibly of fuel oil. Steam pipes burst, scalding ratings. Scenes below deck were indescribable. A direct hit in the after dressing station killed the medical staff and the wounded there. Hatches and doors in all parts of the ship had become jammed owing to distortion, resultant upon the terrific pounding the ship was receiving, and also because heavy wreckage now lay across most of the hatches opening on the upper deck. Crews in 2 magazines became trapped as they were unable to free exit hatches. As rescue parties worked desperately to save trapped men, fires above were raising the temperature within the magazines to a dangerously high level. Finally, the probability of explosion became so acute that rescue work was abandoned. Orders were given to flood, and the imprisoned men were drowned. In the forward canteen, 200 men also became trapped under jammed hatches. At the very moment when a hatch to the upper deck became freed, a direct hit crashed through the deck, transforming the canteen into a charnel house. According to one prisoner, not one man of this group of 200 strong survived, and in making his own escape, he was forced to pick his way between mountains of flesh and bone. This prisoner also described how he passed through the WT room where the entire staff had been blown to pieces. As Bismarck slipped beneath the Atlantic, roughly 800 men managed to escape into the sea. Most did not. An hour later, Dorsetshire pulled 86 survivors from the water, and the destroyer Maori rescued 25 more. The sea was 13 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill quickly. Fearing U-boats, the British broke off the search. Rescue came sporadically afterward. That evening, U-74 found 3 men alive. The next day, the German weather ship Sachsenwald recovered 2 more. Spain's heavy cruiser Canarias, sailing from Ferrol to help, found only the dead, 2 bodies lifted from the swell and later committed to the deep with naval honors. When the sea finally gave up its last accounts, the toll was stark. Of more than 2,200 aboard, only 115 survived. It may be of interest to note that one prisoner from the Bismarck crew mentioned the fact that members of the propaganda company had filmed the battle, remarking that if these films had ever been shown in Germany, there would have been no more volunteers for the German Navy. Burkhard von Müllenheim-Rechberg last saw Lindemann at about 0800 on the command bridge shortly before the final engagement. He later recalled that the usually sharp-minded, humorous, and upbeat Lindemann appeared withdrawn and pessimistic. Von Müllenheim-Rechberg attempted to speak with him, but received no response, and afterward questioned whether this was the result of battle fatigue or whether the ongoing disagreements with Lütjens had finally taken their toll. Lindemann's body was never found, and it is believed that he, Lütjens, and several other officers were likely killed in action when British shell fire struck Bismarck's bridge at 0902. When oceanographer Robert Ballard discovered Bismarck's wreck in 1989, he observed that much of the forward superstructure had been torn away by shell hits, with more than 50 shell impacts concentrated around the conning tower area. This evidence may lend weight to the theory. After Bismarck was sunk, the danger did not immediately end. German aircraft were dispatched to hunt Admiral John Tovey's fuel-starved fleet as it withdrew. On May 28th, bombers struck the destroyers Tartar and Mashona. Mashona was hit on her port side, the bomb exploded in a boiler room, and the damage proved fatal. Tartar rescued about 170 survivors, including Mashona's captain William Selby, but 46 men were lost. The remainder of the British fleet reached port without further incident. Meanwhile, Prince Eugen refueled at sea from the tanker Spichern on the 26th of May. The following day, engine trouble forced her to abandon her Lone Raider mission. Ordered by German command to break off, the cruiser turned for Brest, her Atlantic foray ending not in battle, but in mechanical failure. In another world, maybe the Bismarck would have met her there. At 1100 hours, only 20 minutes after the sinking, Winston Churchill informed the House of Commons gathered at Church House about the operations against Bismarck. This morning, shortly after daybreak, the Bismarck, virtually immobilized without help, was attacked by British battleships that pursued her. I don't know the result of this action. It seems, however, that Bismarck was not sunk by gunfire and now will be sunk by torpedoes. It is believed that this is happening right now. Great as is our loss in the Hood, the Bismarck must be regarded as the most powerful enemy battleship, as she is the newest enemy battleship, and the striking of her from the German Navy is a very definite simplification of the task of maintaining effective mastery of the Northern Sea and maintenance of the Northern Blockade. Mr. Churchill had just sat down when he was given a note. The Prime Minister rose again and said, "I have just received news that the Bismarck is sunk." The cheers were loud and long. The official German announcement of the loss of the Bismarck was given later in the evening. Berlin, May 27th, 1941. The Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht announces, "The battleship Bismarck, which in her first battle against superior British forces sank the Hood and damaged the King George V, had her speed reduced by a hit forward." A torpedo from an aircraft attack that took place on the 24th of May again affected her speed. On May 26th, when 400 miles west of Brest, towards 21 hours, the ship was again hit by 2 aerial torpedoes from aircraft, destroying 1 steering gear and propellers, and the ship was unable to steer. During the night, the Chief of Fleet, Admiral Lutyens, sent the following report to the High Command of the Kriegsmarine. "Ship unable to maneuver. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer. Chief of Fleet." Contending with enemy naval forces which were gradually being reinforced, the battleship Bismarck went on fighting in her incapacitated state, until finally, on the morning of May 27th, she fell victim of the superior strength of 3 battleships, an aircraft carrier, several cruisers, and destroyers. The British formation itself has been attacked early today by German bombers. The thoughts of the entire German people are full of pride and sorrow towards the victorious fleet commander, Admiral Lutyens, during his naval battle in Iceland, towards the battleship Bismarck, her commander, Captain Lindemann, and his brave crew. On June 6, 1941, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder briefed Adolf Hitler at the Berghof on the fate of Bismarck. Hitler pressed hard, why had Admiral Günther Lutyens not turned back after sinking HMS Hood, or destroyed Prince of Wales outright, even at the cost of Bismarck herself? Raeder answered plainly, "Lutyens had acted under orders. Avoid decisive battles unless they blocked the mission. A prolonged duel risked crippling damage and would have ended any chance of attacking merchant shipping, the operation's true purpose." In hindsight, Lutyens has often been judged harshly, but decisions made in fog, fatigue, and uncertainty are easy to dissect only after the fact. Both sides made critical mistakes, German and British alike, and any single error avoided might have changed the outcome entirely. For the Kriegsmarine, the loss of Bismarck was the heaviest single blow of the war. Though German naval power persisted into 1942, her sinking marked a turning point. Heavy surface raiders were effectively abandoned and the fight shifted decisively to submarines. The U-boat campaign would see great successes until its own turning point in May 1943. Bismarck's end also underscored a deeper change. The aircraft carrier had proven decisive, eclipsing the battleship as the dominant weapon at sea, a lesson reinforced at Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea. Today, the battleship era is long past, yet the story of Bismarck, her brief career, her ferocious resistance, and the men who fought her endures. A legend forged in steel, fire, and the unforgiving Atlantic.